Harold Benton, a 68-year-old retired Army veteran, sat on the porch of his Georgia home, his weathered hands resting on the wooden railing. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the sprawling lawn, as the sound of children's laughter echoed from the backyard. His 60-year-old wife, Kelsey, was inside, preparing dinner, her movements calm and graceful. To anyone who drove by, they would see a picture of perfect suburban life. Their home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside Atlanta, had always been a symbol of stability. Harold's military service had afforded them the luxury of a comfortable life, a life they had built together after years of sacrifice. Kelsey, his high school sweetheart, had been by his side through it all. They raised 3 children, Lisa, Derek, and Weah, who were now all grown and living their own lives, but always came home for family gatherings. Harold had served in the Army for over 30 years, retiring with honors. He was proud of his service, the medals he'd earned, and the steady paycheck that had supported his family. Kelsey had been a stay-at-home mom until their children were older, and then she worked part-time as a secretary at a local law office. She had always been the glue that held the family together, always planning the holidays, organizing family events, and making sure everyone felt loved. Their children, Lisa, the oldest, a sharp, successful corporate lawyer, Derek, the middle child, a thoughtful, quiet architect, and Weah, the youngest, an up-and-coming tech entrepreneur, were all thriving. Harold and Kelsey doted on their grandchildren, enjoying the quiet moments in their golden years. They had everything they could want: health, wealth, and the love of their children. But like any family, there were cracks, subtle fissures, hidden beneath the surface. Harold was beginning to feel the weight of age and regret. He had sacrificed so much for his family, years of deployment, long stretches of time away from his children, and the psychological toll of war that still lingered in his mind. He loved his family dearly, but a part of him was beginning to wonder if the sacrifices had been worth it. Had he truly been appreciated, or had his absence over the years created a rift between him and the people he loved most? Kelsey had always been the emotional center of their family. She knew how to make everyone feel at home, how to comfort when things were tough. But recently, Harold had noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed distant at times, preoccupied with something. It wasn't obvious, just small things. A distracted glance, a phone call she wouldn't take in front of him, a hesitation when he asked about her day. Harold dismissed these as the natural signs of getting older, of the quiet space that settled over couples as they aged. But deep down, something gnawed at him. Harold's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Kelsey's voice calling from the kitchen, announcing dinner was ready. He stood up, stretching his back and making his way inside, where the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. He smiled, kissed Kelsey on the cheek, and sat at the table. The perfect family. At least, that's what everyone thought. But in the silence between their words, Harold felt a growing unease, a sense that the perfect family he had worked so hard to build might be nothing more than an illusion. And he had no idea just how close that illusion was to shattering. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Harold's world began to crack. The phone rang, shattering the stillness of their dinner table. Harold set his fork down as Kelsey's face blanched, her eyes widening in sudden panic. Their grandson Noah, only 6 years old, had collapsed at school. The doctors suspected something serious, and they were rushing him to the hospital. Harold's mind raced as Kelsey immediately grabbed her coat and rushed for the door, calling out to him to come with her. They spent hours at the hospital, waiting in sterile hallways under harsh fluorescent lights, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. Noah had been running a fever that day, but no one had expected this. He had been a healthy, energetic boy, always laughing, always full of life. Yet now they stood in a cold hospital waiting room, watching doctors rush in and out, uncertainty looming over every word spoken. The doctors eventually explained that Noah's condition was serious, but not yet fully understood. They suggested that genetic testing might help determine if there was an underlying condition that had contributed to his collapse. Harold, although anxious, agreed immediately. They would do whatever was necessary to help Noah. The doctors assured them that genetic testing was the next logical step. It wasn't long before Harold and Kelsey were in a hospital office, signing papers and providing the necessary consent for the tests. Kelsey was quiet, her hand trembling slightly as she held the pen. Harold noticed a change in her. Her usual calm composure was cracked now, as if some unseen weight had settled on her shoulders. But there was no time to dwell on it. Noah's health was all that mattered. A few days later, the test results came back, and Harold found himself sitting in his living room, the paper in front of him. His eyes scanned the words, the numbers, the results, the genetic test confirming that he was not biologically related to his grandson. The doctor had called him to explain the anomaly, assuring him that it could be a mistake, a clerical error. But Harold couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. A genetic mix-up? It was an absurd thought, but the numbers didn't lie. The results were clear. His blood didn't match Noah's. It was impossible to ignore the seed of doubt planted deep within Harold's chest. He felt a coldness seep into his veins, a sudden, bitter chill that he couldn't explain. That night, after Kelsey had gone to bed, Harold sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the test results. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He opened the browser and searched for DNA testing kits. It was a decision born from frustration, from the urge to find answers that didn't make sense. If he wasn't Noah's grandfather, then what else was a lie? The next morning, Harold quietly ordered 3 DNA testing kits, one for himself, one for Kelsey, and one for each of his 3 children, Lisa, Derek, and Weah. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks in his family's facade were growing wider, and he needed to understand why. Kelsey noticed the change in Harold's demeanor, but didn't question him. She couldn't know what had triggered this sudden need for answers. As the days went by, Harold's mind swirled with confusion, anger, and fear. Was this just a mistake, or was something much darker lurking beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life? In the stillness of the night, Harold's thoughts turned to his children. Had they been lying to him all these years? Was there a hidden truth he'd never suspected? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, and the calm life he thought he had built began to crumble, piece by piece. Harold sat at his kitchen table, the envelope unopened before him. It was late afternoon, but the house felt eerily quiet. The sun had set hours ago, and the house was shrouded in darkness, save for the glow of the kitchen light. His hands were still trembling from the moment he'd retrieved the envelope from a mailbox, the weight of it too much to bear. For days, he had steeled himself against the inevitability of the truth. The tests were back, no more waiting. Yet, as Harold stared at the envelope, he couldn't summon the courage to open it. The small piece of paper that could shatter his entire world, the answers that might change everything, lay there, mocking him. He glanced around the room, as if searching for a sign, something to ground him, to tell him that this was all a mistake. But there was nothing, just the flicker of the kitchen light overhead, casting long shadows across the table. Harold had always believed he had the perfect family. He had built his life around that belief, his children, his wife, his home. And yet, in the quiet corners of his mind, seeds of doubt had begun to sprout. First, it had been the unexpected results of Noah's genetic test. Now, the DNA kits were his attempt to prove the unthinkable wrong. But now, the truth seemed inevitable, and it hit him harder than he could have imagined. With a deep breath, he finally tore open the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, cold, and sterile, the words printed in bold, clinical language. Harold's heart raced as he read the first result, Lisa, no match. His stomach churned. He forced himself to read Derek's results next. Again, no match. The blood drained from his face. It couldn't be real. There had to be a mistake. But as he moved on to the last result, his hands went numb. Weah, no match. Each name echoed through his mind like a distant drumbeat, growing louder and louder, until the silence of the room was deafening. His chest tightened. He was frozen in place, his eyes glued to the words that tore through him like jagged shards of glass. None of his children were his. The blood that had flowed through his veins, the memories he'd shared with them, the love and sacrifice, it was all a lie. The family he thought he had built his life around, the children he had raised as his own, were not his blood. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in with an oppressive weight. Harold blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog that clouded his vision. He felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him, leaving him suspended in a void. His mind struggled to comprehend what had just been revealed. He had been betrayed, not just by his wife, but by his own children. For years he had believed that Lisa, Derek, and Wea were his legacy, his flesh and blood, a continuation of everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. But now all of it seemed hollow, meaningless. Harold's breath grew shallow. Anger surged through him, hot and vicious, burning in his chest. But alongside the fury, there was a deep sense of loss, an overwhelming grief for the life he thought he had, for the family he thought he knew. It was as if the very foundation of his existence had crumbled, and there was nothing left but the wreckage. His mind raced. How could Kelsey have hidden this from him? How long had she known? How many lies had she told to keep this secret buried? And what about the children? Had they known the truth? Had they all been complicit in this elaborate deception? Harold sank into the chair, clutching the results in his trembling hands. He felt as though he were drowning in a sea of betrayal and confusion, unsure of who he was anymore. The man who had once prided himself on his integrity, his unwavering sense of honor, was now a man lost in a world of lies. The pain was unbearable, and as the minutes ticked by, the anger within him began to grow, gnawing at him like a hunger that could never be sated. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed closure. He needed to understand why his wife, the woman he had trusted for decades, had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. The truth had come crashing down on him like a freight train, and Harold knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Harold sat in the dim light of the living room, the silence weighing heavily on him. The DNA results were still fresh in his mind, a cruel reminder of the life he thought he knew. His thoughts drifted back to the days when he was a young man, fresh out of boot camp, ready to face the world. The military had molded him into someone who could endure hardships, someone who could sacrifice for the greater good. And that's exactly what he had done for his family. His first deployment had taken him far from home. He remembered the heat of the desert, the sting of the dust in his eyes, the endless nights spent on watch, listening for the slightest sound that might indicate danger. But even amidst the chaos and tension, he found a strange comfort in the thought that his family was safe, tucked away in Georgia, far from the danger he faced. Kelsey, Lisa, Derek, and Wea were waiting for him to come home, and the idea of them kept him going through the long days and sleepless nights. But as he sat there now, the weight of the past felt unbearable. All those years of dedication, all the missed birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, they had been for nothing, it seemed. Harold had given up so much for his family, but in the end, what had it all amounted to? His mind wandered back to the long stretches of time when he'd been overseas, disconnected from everything except the job at hand. He had known Kelsey had her hands full with the children, but he had trusted her. She was the rock he had come home to after every mission, the one person he could rely on when the world felt like it was falling apart. But now, as the pieces of his life came crashing down around him, Harold began to question how much of their life together had been real. He had been gone for months at a time, and in that time, Kelsey had been left to raise their children on her own. But had she really been alone? Harold had always believed in the strength of their marriage, but now he wondered if she had filled the void he'd left with someone else, perhaps more than one someone. The possibility of her infidelities had always been a distant thought, something he had pushed away, never willing to entertain. But now, the reality of it seemed unavoidable. The truth stung deeper than any physical wound he had ever sustained in combat. He had sacrificed his time, his safety, and his peace of mind for his family, believing he was doing the right thing. But while he was overseas, fighting for the country he loved, his wife had been living a life of deceit, a life that had torn apart everything he thought he knew. The military had taught him how to compartmentalize his emotions, how to push through pain and fear, but nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't an enemy he could defeat with discipline or strategy. This was his own wife, his own children, his own family, and they had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. As he thought back to those long nights, sitting alone in a foreign country, all the questions he had never asked began to surface. Had Kelsey's actions been a form of rebellion against his absence, or had she simply grown tired of waiting? Harold realized that he may never truly understand the motivations behind her betrayal. What hurt the most wasn't the infidelity itself. It was the years of deception, the way she had lived a double life while he had been away, doing everything in his power to protect and provide for her and their children. The anger inside Harold began to simmer, a slow burn that grew stronger with every passing minute. He had been fighting battles overseas, but the war that had now been waged in his own home was far more devastating. He couldn't reconcile the man he had been, the soldier who had sacrificed everything, with the man he had become, a man broken by betrayal. As the memories of his deployments continued to flood his mind, Harold felt the weight of his decisions, of the years he had spent away from his family, pulling him deeper into a spiral of anger and despair. The military had taught him how to endure, but nothing had prepared him for the gut-wrenching realization that the person he had trusted most had betrayed him beyond repair. The days following the discovery of the DNA results were a blur for Harold. He moved through the motions of daily life with a numbness that was foreign to him. The house, once filled with laughter and the warmth of family gatherings, now felt hollow, each corner echoing with memories he no longer trusted. He avoided family dinners, the holidays that once meant so much to him. When Lisa, Derek, or Wea called, he found excuses not to engage. His phone, once full of pictures and messages of joy, was now littered with reminders of a life he could no longer reconcile with the present. He began deleting photos, the evidence of years spent with the children who weren't really his, the smiling faces of a family that had been a lie. Harold had always been a man of action, someone who took control of his circumstances. But now he was paralyzed by the knowledge of what he had lost. His once loving, vibrant spirit had been replaced by a coldness, a distance that he didn't know how to bridge. He had been the pillar of his family for so long, the steady hand guiding them through the storms of life. But now the very foundation of his existence was crumbling beneath him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Kelsey noticed the change in Harold almost immediately. Her once affectionate husband had become a shadow of the man she married. He no longer smiled in her presence, no longer initiated conversations or expressed his thoughts. She attributed it to his age, perhaps the weight of years beginning to take a toll on him. After all, he had been through so much in his life, decades of military service, raising children, and now retirement. Surely it was normal to withdraw a bit, she reasoned. But even as she tried to rationalize his behavior, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She would attempt to reach out, offering him dinner or small gestures of affection, but he would turn away, always finding an excuse to be elsewhere. Sometimes he would retreat to his study, a room that had once been a sanctuary of work and study for both of them, but now it seemed to hold only emptiness. There, in the silence of his own thoughts, Harold began to write. The pages of his private journal became his only true outlet. He poured his heart out, recounting the years of sacrifice, the long nights away, the moments of pride he had once felt as a father, and now the unbearable weight of betrayal. His words were filled with anger, frustration, and a deep sense of loss. He had always believed in loyalty, in commitment, in the family unit. But now, those values seemed like distant ideals, shattered by the actions of the woman he had trusted most. In the quiet of the night, when the house was still, Harold would read over his journal entries, each one darker than the last. He began to question everything, his role in the family, the love he had given, the sacrifice he had made. Had it all been for nothing? He struggled to understand the motive behind Kelsey's infidelity. What had driven her to betray him? Was it a lack of love, or had she simply grown bored with the life they had built together? And worse yet, had she known all along that she had been keeping a secret from him, a secret he would never have suspected? Meanwhile, Kelsey, oblivious to the depth of Harold's pain, continued to wonder what had happened to the man she had once known. She couldn't understand why he had become so distant, so cold. She tried to remember the last time they had shared a meaningful conversation, the last time they had truly connected. But nothing came to mind. Every effort to bridge the gap seemed futile, and Kelsey found herself growing more and more frustrated. She could sense that Harold was retreating into himself, but she couldn't comprehend the cause. She had no idea that her husband, the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin, now harbored a truth so painful that it had broken something inside him that could never be fixed. The sun barely peeked through the drawn curtains as Harold sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly together. The house was still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It had been weeks since he had discovered the truth, the horrible, shattering truth, and the silence between him and Kelsey had grown unbearable. The secrets had festered long enough. Today, he could no longer bear the weight of the lies. Kelsey entered the kitchen, her soft footsteps betraying the uncertainty she felt. She had seen the coldness in Harold's eyes, felt the growing distance between them, and now she could feel the tension in the air. She had tried to reach out, but nothing seemed to work. She couldn't understand what had happened to the man she once loved. Had his mind slipped? Was he losing himself? "Harold," she began, her voice faltering. "What's going on? Why have you been avoiding me? I can't take this silence anymore. What are you so angry about?" Harold didn't answer at first. He simply stared at her, his eyes vacant, a storm brewing behind them. He had always been a man of few words, a soldier who had weathered countless battles in his life. But this was different. The weight of betrayal had altered him in ways that no one could have predicted. His silence was deafening, and Kelsey, though confused, was beginning to sense the magnitude of the reckoning that was about to unfold. "Kelsey," he said finally, his voice low but steady, "I know everything." Kelsey froze, her breath catching in her throat. The blood drained from her face. She stood motionless, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She had hoped that her secret would remain buried forever, that the years of deception could stay hidden behind the facade of their so-called perfect life. But now, it seemed, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, and she had nowhere to hide. With shaky hands, she reached for the chair across from him and sat down slowly. Her voice trembled as she spoke, trying to hold back tears. I never wanted you to know. It was in the past, Harold. It was a mistake a long time ago. It meant nothing. Nothing at all. Please, try to understand. It's over now. It has been for years." Harold's eyes narrowed as he listened, his heart pounding. She was talking like it had all been some fleeting moment in time, something that could be brushed away, forgotten, like a bad dream. But this was no bad dream. This was his life, the foundation of everything he had known, shattered in an instant. "Did you ever really love me?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question he expected an answer to, but one he needed to ask anyway. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear her response. Her answer didn't matter anymore. Not after everything. Kelsey's hands trembled as she wiped a tear from her cheek. "Of course, Harold. I love you. I always have. But things happened, and I was weak. I didn't want to hurt you. I was afraid of losing everything we built together." Harold's silence grew heavier, suffocating the air between them. He had listened to her, absorbed her words, but they felt like empty promises. Words spoken without any real understanding of the pain she had caused. He had sacrificed so much for this family, and now the truth hung in the air like an unbearable weight. And in that silence, something inside Harold snapped. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and all the rage he had kept bottled up inside him erupted like a dam breaking loose. He felt betrayed, emasculated, and utterly alone. The years of hard work, the sacrifices he had made, all seemed meaningless in the face of this devastating truth. With a calmness that sent chills down Kelsey's spine, Harold stood up. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He reached into the drawer beside him, the one where he had hidden the gun, a weapon he had kept for years, but had never intended to use. He pulled it out slowly, his grip tight around the handle. Kelsey's eyes widened in horror. "Harold, what are you doing? Please, put that down. I'm sorry. Please don't." But Harold didn't hear her. The world had narrowed, his vision clouded by the fury that coursed through his veins. He had never been a violent man, but in that moment he saw red. His mind raced with memories of his years of devotion, his endless service to a family that had turned its back on him. He had been the rock, the provider, the protector. And now it all meant nothing. With a single, swift motion, Harold raised the gun. The shot rang out, echoing through the house, shattering the fragile silence. Kelsey's eyes widened in shock as the bullet struck her chest, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Her face twisted in confusion and pain, but she couldn't understand what had happened until it was too late. Harold stood over her, his breath ragged. His mind was a blur of rage and betrayal. Without a word, he turned the gun on himself, ending the torment that had consumed him for weeks. The final shot was muffled, but the pain, the regret, and the silence that followed were deafening. In that house, the echoes of a broken family would never fade. The silence that filled the Benton home was deafening. The flashing lights of the police cars outside illuminated the otherwise darkened house, casting long shadows across the front yard. The officers had arrived too late. Inside, the bodies of Harold and Kelsey lay cold and lifeless. The blood had dried on the floor, staining not only the kitchen, but also the remnants of a family's dreams. It was a crime that no one could have predicted, not in a million years. Lisa, Derek, and Wea stood frozen in shock, their hearts heavy with disbelief. The news had hit them like a sledgehammer. At first, it felt like a cruel prank, a nightmare they couldn't escape. But the flashing lights, the police cars in their driveway, and the somber expressions on the officers' faces told them it was all too real. Their father, the man who had taught them right from wrong, who had served his country with honor, had taken the life of their mother. And then he had taken his own. The foundation of their entire existence, their family, had crumbled in a matter of hours, leaving only shattered pieces of memories. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The police took photos, collected evidence, and questioned the neighbors who had heard the gunshots echo through the quiet suburb. But no answers could bring the Bentons back. No explanation could undo the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak. Lisa, the eldest of the three, had been the first to arrive at the house. She had received the call from a family friend, someone who had heard the gunshots, and immediately called 911. Lisa's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled into the house, the cold chill of dread seeping into her bones. The sight of her mother's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor was enough to paralyze her. Harold's body lay next to hers, blood mingling in a tragic, irreversible mix. "How did this happen?" Derek whispered, his voice breaking as he stood beside Lisa, his eyes searching for any shred of understanding. But there was no answer, only silence. Wea, the youngest, hadn't yet arrived. When he did, he would be hit by the full weight of the tragedy. But nothing could prepare him for the pain that would follow. The betrayal of their father, the heartbreak of losing both parents, and the pain of knowing that everything they had believed in was a lie. In the coming days, the Benton family's grief would be swallowed by the media storm that followed. Local news outlets reported the tragedy, turning it into the darkest story in their small Georgia town. The neighbors who once saw Harold and Kelsey as the embodiment of the American dream, two parents raising a perfect family, were now left to grapple with the horrific reality of what had transpired behind closed doors. As the police took their statements and began piecing together the events leading to the double murder-suicide, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. Harold Benton, a man who had given his all to his country and his family, had finally snapped. The cracks that had formed over the years were now exposed for everyone to see, and they were too deep to repair. The Benton house, once filled with laughter and family gatherings, was now a haunting reminder of broken trust, devastating secrets, and irreversible decisions. The family's grief would not be measured in days or weeks, but in years to come, as they would forever be left with the scars of betrayal and loss. And the silence that followed? It was deafening. What do you think pushed Harold to the breaking point? Do you believe the betrayal was enough to justify his tragic actions? Or was there another path he could have taken? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story captivating and want to hear more true crime tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring these dark and twisted stories to light. Stay tuned for more chilling content.